This program is a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, and the Friends of Firing Line.
As everybody who reads anything knows, the author Tom Wolfe has come out with a huge novel. It arrived newborn as #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and is likely to snooze there until every American who can read has bought it. It's a book that stuns and overwhelms its readers with its delight, scenes centering on life and times in modern Atlanta, Georgia, taking us also to prison life in California and to the mechanics of horse breeding. But also there are critics, notably John Updike and Norman Mailer, who enter a reservation or two, which we'll touch on if time permits. Tom Wolfe is a Southerner, a graduate of Washington and Lee, who earned a doctorate in American Studies at Yale, and then began his career in journalism, bestowing honors books with such titles as The Candy-Colored Tangerine Flake Streamline Baby, Radical Chic, and Mau Mauing the Flack Catchers. He has been a guest of Firing Line to discuss his critical essays on architecture and on much modern art. Let's begin by asking a question raised by Norman Mailer. It is this: does an effort to write a bestseller tend for inherent reasons to compromise the work of an artist? What artists in our century have also been bestsellers besides yourself?
I had to laugh when I read those lines. I mean, this is marvelous creating of polar positions for entertainment and serious literature. If you go back to particularly the great novelists, American novelists of the first half of the century, they were all aiming for the top of the bestseller list and often got there. John Steinbeck, Sinclair Lewis. I can't think of a man more popular in his own time. He was our first Nobel laureate in literature. And the same was true of Scott Fitzgerald, and not so much in his first book, but after that, Ernest Hemingway. So it's, I think, a very novel idea that there is this, which would have surprised Shakespeare a great deal, that there's a split between popularity and seriousness.
Well, what is it, what point is one trying to make that the lure of the marketplace distracts from the lure of the muse?
Well, we have, and since this happened since the Second World War, in literary circles in the United States, people have begun to veer towards an extreme that the Japanese call pure literature. Mm-hmm. Japan's greatest novelist, certainly since the Second World War, Mishima, is not considered a major novelist among Japanese literati because he was too popular. His books sold far too many copies. The big shift occurs when the American literary world tries to be European. It was in the 1880s, while Zola was still a great figure, that in French literary circles, an emphasis was put on the psychological and away from the realistic and the social. Zola was able to weather that storm, but after that, there became more and more of a split.
In Europe.
In Europe.
Yeah.
And there's only one area in which America still has some colonial position with regard to Europe, and that's in the arts, which always amuses me. Every other area, the military, business, science, medicine, whatever it may be, no one in the United States is thinking, but cares for 3 seconds what anyone in Europe is thinking, unless they have a contribution to make. In the arts, there's still, we have a lag, and we begin to try to be like the Europeans and to start thinking of pure literature, for example.
Well, is this the same bias that obtrudes into the academy, where professors are sort of downgraded if their books become too popular, unless there's a certain type Samuelson. But is it part of the same problem?
I think it's probably
you should be obscure if you are true to your calling.
I think it's precisely that, and Samuelson is forgiven because I think his book is so mainly as a text, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well, Jasper Johns is entertaining, is he?
Not to me.
Not to me either. He's I think they want $15 million, $16 million for something that they bought for $20,000 over at the Metropolitan, over at Lincoln Center. But still, the what is it that Norman Mailer is trying to say? That, for instance, in your own book, at which junction might he have said you'd sort of gone that way at the beckoning of Olympia and not that way?
Well, if I may, let me try to put Norman into perspective.
Yeah.
It was not only Norman Mailer, but also John Updike rushed into print. These old men, and since I'm about their age, I can call them that. These old men who should be reserving their strength and conserving their energy suddenly had to rise up from off of their pallets and try to shoot this book down. And I think it was because I had predicted in 1973, this is 14 years before I had ever written a novel or really seriously thought about it. In an introduction to a book called The New Journalism, I made the prediction that the future of the American novel, if it was to have a future, was in a highly detailed realism, achievable only by reporting, along the lines of what Zola meant when he talked of naturalism. And I think I raised that specter first with The Bonfire of the Vanities. Then 11 years went by and I hadn't been heard from, but then I wrote A Man in Full. And I honestly believe that suddenly this book, which captured so much attention, suddenly I was on the cover of Time magazine. This was cast a shadow certainly in the minds of people like Mailer and Updike. And they suddenly found themselves in the dark, because if this kind of novel, highly detailed realism, based on reporting, was to be any sort of new standard, their reputations were in serious trouble, as I think they are. And if you find yourself in the dark, somewhat frightened, what do? You whistle. You whistle in the dark. And I think these extremely long pieces that they wrote, and old men should not write book reviews that go on for 4,000 and 5,000 words, was an example of
tires them out.
It tires you out. I mean, I couldn't imagine doing it myself.
Well, no, Updike said the laboriousness derives in part from the worked-up quality of many scenes, masterpieces of creative journalism, but a little thick for floating suspense and characters with free will. He went on to say that the preeningly expert architectural details, the avid sartorial specifics, the infallibly lively decors in all their dubious taste. Now that's not a frivolous point, is it?
I believe that the use he's putting it to is well, it's not so much frivolous as wishful thinking. You notice the word journalism suddenly is in there, and in Mailer's piece, it's not the work of a novelist. So that's what I've done has to be characterized as something else. It's not literature. It's entertainment. It's journalism, and so on. I suppose there is a point to be made that details should not be useless. I mean, anyone can agree on that, and I think that's about all he has said in that particular statement.
Well, let's explore this a little bit. Norman Mailer wrote a highly acclaimed book about the guy who he killed somebody in a gas station, didn't he?
Gary Gilmore.
Gary Gilmore, yeah. And I think he was the first person executed after that long hiatus. It was a very big book and done in great detail. Now he presumably vouchsafed us that as literature, right?
I'm sure he would.
Well, but was it also work of a journalist?
Of course it was.
Like Truman Capote's
well,
work.
One little bit of history, one little footnote to that.
Yeah.
This book, the Execution of Song by Norman
Right.
Mailer, should have taught Norman a great lesson. It's probably the best book he ever wrote, and it's based completely on reporting. He did, as I understand, he did not do the reporting. A photographer named Lawrence Schiller did the reporting and the interviews with Gary Gilmore, and I don't believe Norman ever met Gary Gilmore, who was still alive at that time. But the material in the form of transcripts was apparently given to him. Wonderful material, marvelous material. And he proceeded to write a first-rate book, which supports my theory that what we look upon as success or even genius in literature is about 70% material and 30% talent. When you start off in writing, you like to believe that it's 95% talent and 5% material, because all you've got when you start out is talent. And the rest is just this little bit of clay that you are forced to use. As I get older, I'm more and more convinced that at the heart of great literature is great material.
Well, now, does it presuppose that certain people we have in mind are averse to journalism because they don't have the kind of energy to do it, or is it because they disdain it inherently?
Oh, they're embarrassed to do it. I've worked for 10 years on newspapers, always as a general assignment reporter, which is the lowest but also the best rung in the newspaper business. You're not stuck in any sort of beat. You're sent out to cover a police story one day and to do a feature story on a man who has a 103-year-old turtle the next day. You see all of these sides of life. And by and by you learn that reporting is not a skill.
It's not a skill?
It's not a skill. It's an attitude. And the attitude is, I have the right to get information from you to which I am not entitled. That's the heart of the attitude of the reporter. And many people, many writers particularly, once they've thought of themselves as serious creatures, find this terribly embarrassing. To be this beggar 1 minute waiting for information, and this badger the next minute who's prodding people to try to get information and going inside of people's houses to get photographs of the deceased and so forth and so on.
But what you're telling us is that the information he prods is information he could not otherwise have got, right?
Right.
So how do we account for people who write successful novels about periods gone by?
Well, many of these embarrassed writers who can't stand the humiliating thought of being a reporter, this lowly, conniving creature, the bottom of the literary status order, are not embarrassed by going to the New York Public Library and looking back into the lives of Lord Nelson and what was their name? Hamilton, Emma Hamilton, whatever it was. That's fine.
That's okay.
That's okay, because you don't have to soil your hands to do it. You just sit in the library and get the material. And often they don't have material. So I can think of one of our novelists who has resorted over and over again to writing historical novels, having removed himself from the country and having very little other material to write about.
Well, John Dos Passos, is he thought of as having created literature, notwithstanding that he was a journalist?
He was considered, I guess, a absolutely wonderful literary figure until he left the left wing of the literary movement politically in the 1930s. I happen to believe that Dos Passos is one of the most important figures in our literary history. The form in which I Cast a Man in Full and A Bonfire of the Vanities of having characters who don't know each other at the outset of a story, never heard of one another, and you follow their lives, and then they begin to collide. Dos Passos started that with books like Manhattan Transfer and USA, the USA Trilogy.
Does that tradition live?
Well, it was picked up by John O'Hara, and curiously enough, Sartre in France did a trilogy of novels, his so-called wartime novels, and he was very much, which he openly said, influenced by John Dos Passos, who became a much bigger figure in France than here. Well, I got it from O'Hara. I sat down back in the 80s to write my first novel. I said, "Oh my God, what do you do?" So I read some O'Hara, and his first two novels, particularly Appointment in Samara and Butterfield 8, used this technique wonderfully, and it is so much in keeping with the life we live today, where people can move around so easily, and you're constantly colliding with figures that in another era you would have never met. So anyway, I didn't mean to digress on Dos Passos, but I think he is owed much greater tribute than he gets.
Well, you know, your notion that a talent will take you as far as you need to go, I'm interested in for personal reasons. I mean, I've published 11 novels, and I'm going off to write one next couple of weeks. But in reading your book, I was once again stupefied by the technique you have for describing. For instance, I said to my secretary, we go, "Can you find me a book that has women in it dressed differently, so that I can describe my heroine or my lady here, other than saying she was wearing a sweater and a pearl necklace and her hair and bangs?" And the answer is she can't. She told she can't find it. So I may have to simply go through all of your books and prescind passages that give me hints. I might twist things up a little bit so you won't sue me.
Well, you're welcome to any of that material. I'm certainly not above stealing phrases and descriptions myself.
Well, I guess my point is that is it experience so to speak, in the journalistic streets that teaches you to to be able to write the way you dress, or aren't you willing to assume that that's simply kind of an inherent congenital talent?
I believe. Well, you mentioned at the outset, you were kind enough to mention that I had been in graduate school at Yale. While I was there, in the American Studies department, I was forced, much against my predilections, to read some sociology. I had the typical liberal arts student's disdain for sociology as this new and second-rate science, and was deeply impressed, as I remain today, by the work of Max Weber, the man who introduced the word status, as we now use it in status seeking, into the...
And charisma, right?
And charisma,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And I began to see that these things that seem so frivolous to us, like the way people dress and the kind of cars they drive, and how they speak to servants or don't speak to servants, how they conduct themselves in a restaurant or don't, these are in fact an essential part of life. And every day, at every moment, we are constantly assessing the people that we meet and deal with to figure out in our own minds just where they rank in society and how they should be dealt with and what you might be able to get away with in their cases. And so I think it becomes an essential part of the novelist's arsenal.
Oh no, I think it's wonderfully used, but the acquisition of that skill requires a discipline that doesn't work for anybody. I mean, for instance, it doesn't work with me, and I don't believe you learned that in sociology at graduate school.
Well, we get then back to the journalistic attitude,
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I'm sure that if you really wanted any of these things, you could get them.
Well, the people who write catalogs for auctions, and they describe this chair, and they tell you exactly what it looks like, and it's this marvelous flowing style, and or the insurance people who evaluate your stuff, they're gifted in this. I guess what I'm trying to get you to acknowledge is that is a special skill which really lies outside the line of fire of what you and Mailer are disagreeing about. Was he good on that in the Executioner song? Details of that kind?
As I recall, I don't recall it, and I have a feeling it didn't interest him. Of course, he was also didn't see any of this, so it would be hard for him to describe it. But
so you was going for photographs?
I wonder if he even had. Well, I just don't know. I really don't know exactly what he had. But it's the real difference is I think it's essential to do this sort of thing, and presumably he and most contemporary novelists wouldn't. But Balzac, one of my idols, was constantly describing furniture. He often would begin a chapter with a description of the room where the action was going to take place, and he would tick off the fake damask curtains and the threadbare and probably knocked off Aubusson rug on the floor, all by way of telling the reader exactly what kind of people these were before you even see them. Finally, Saint-Beuve, the leading critic of his day, said in exasperation, if this man Balzac is so in love with furniture, why doesn't he open up a shop and spare us these useless details? Well, I happen to think Balzac was correct and Saint-Beuve was wrong.
No, well, I don't, for 1 minute, underrated, but I assigned to its acquisition certain special. Let me touch on the one point in your novel in which I thought you were making what strikes this reader as sort of a fashionable concession. You get Conrad. He's the one really good guy in this book, and he is swept up by the philosophy of Stoicism in its latter form under Epictetus. Now that transforms his living, transforms ultimately the life of the major character Croker in Atlanta. And all of a sudden I found myself, what do the Stoics have that's relevant to this transformation that Christianity doesn't have?
That is an interesting question, because I have now received recently 2 letters from priests whom I respect enormously, who have said, it looks to me as if you've taken the first step, but don't you realize there's another one that might be taken?
And to find Christ via Stoicism, via Epictetus?
Well, the Stoics apparently had a considerable influence on the early Christians. It was a Roman religion. Epictetus himself was a Greek who had been sold by his parents as a slave to Rome. And the seeds of the idea that the meek will inherit the earth is in Stoicism.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's 90% of what you touch on is Judaic, Christian. That's why I wondered why you felt a need to pull out this sort of remote philosophical figure whose glamour doesn't seem to be nearly as palpable as that which we find in the Bible.
Well, this character Conrad, who was a 23-year-old warehouse worker, married and has 2 children, is part of the generation that Douglas Copeland, who gave us the term Generation X, wrote a novel called Generation X, has called the first generation without after God, the first generation after God. In fact, he wrote a novel called Life After God, in which the youngsters in the novel are born to parents who themselves had no real sense of religion, and certainly had no official religion whatsoever. And this was Conrad's situation. He was born to hippies who really never believed in anything other than being cool. He had no experience of religion whatsoever. And I liked the idea of his finding religion in a form that you wouldn't read in the newspapers. You read about religion in the newspapers all the time. There are mentions of religion on television constantly, but not of Stoicism, which was itself a religion in its day.
And goes with being in jail.
And then winds up in jail and worships, as I tried to make quite manifest, not God, but Zeus, because that's what they talk about, that's what Epictetus in his discourses talks about Zeus, who was treated as a single god, you know,
a generic god.
A generic god rather than one of many Greek or Roman gods. And I said, what is it like in our day to find religion without going to some well-known quarter, whether it's Billy Graham or some established church, and have it just happen to you?
Thank you, Tom Wolfe, author of Man in Full. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
This program was a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, and the Friends of Firing Line. For information about a video cassette of this program, write to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. Or call 803-799-3449. That's Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. Or call 803-799-3449.